Luke Ford here. Lost my previous stream after 10 minutes, so I'll try to retrace my point. So there's a lot of talk on the right-wing side that Republicans need to launch similar lawfare efforts against Democrats, comparable to what Democrats are doing against Donald Trump. So one reaction I have is that Democrats aren't using these type of lawfare tactics against anyone else but Donald Trump. It's not like they're just using this against generic Republicans. Second reaction that I have is there enough expertise on the side of the Republicans to launch effectively this type of lawfare, right? There is a price to be paid for Republicans becoming the low IQ party. And so the higher someone's verbal IQ, the more likely, according to various surveys, the more likely it is that someone will oppose Donald Trump. So when people with a verbal IQ above 130 oppose Donald Trump by a ratio of something like 10 to 1, then it's hard to find the kind of expertise that you need to conduct these lawfare strategies. The Democrats were very effective in what they just did. They were legally effective. Now, will their legal effectiveness be overturned upon appeal? Because I would expect that the Trump's team will focus on the weakest parts of the Democrats' case, and that's the completely unprecedented legal theory that underlay the case. I don't know any other first world nation that would have given Donald Trump the equivalent of a felony conviction for what he did with the payoff to Stormy Daniels. So you would not have been able to push forward a felony conviction in the state of New York, except for the state of New York deliberately, completely rewrote its legal law book in this regard and changed the rules to enable this prosecution of Donald Trump. So do Republicans have the effectiveness and the brain power to do the same thing? And then on appeal, right, Trump's team will go after the very weakest part of the prosecution case, right? The strongest part of their case was the narrative that Trump is a sleazeball who lies. Right, I think it's pretty evident that Donald Trump slept with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, and that Trump has, a habit of lying. I thought Trump's Friday speech in reaction to the conviction was very weak. Right, he's yet to articulate a convincing rationale for why his conviction is really bad for Americans. So as long as he remains petty and venal in his primary reactions to this conviction, I don't see how he's going to be able to leverage this case to his advantage. So Democrats feel fantastic after this conviction because they feel that Trump has been able to skate through consequence-free through the political process, and so you needed this new legal process, even a completely unprecedented, legal process to hold him accountable. But the cathartic reaction on the left, will this not drain them of energy? While on the right, I see this furious release of energy. So on that basis, right, it seems that the right is far more energized than the left, as opposed to when Donald Trump won in 2016, we saw more energy released on the left than the right, which is a large reason why Donald Trump was so constrained in his first presidential term, because he aroused far more opposition and intensity on the left than he was able to arouse support and conviction and drive on the right. So in politics, you want to arouse your own base more than you arouse the opposition.
By this, and it touches on things that you two have both raised now.
So this is Patrick Healy. He's gay. He's on the left. He's a former political correspondent for the New York Times. Now he's moved over to the op-ed side.
While our institutions have often held up with...
Well, I think our legal institutions.
Our legal institutions have held up. That's the thing. The ability of Donald Trump and his team to have a playbook for almost any situation where, at the end of the day, even if reputations are scarred and people are thrown under the bus, he is still able to evade accountability. I only really saw that in the 2020 election, ultimately, at the ballot box. And I've just found myself thinking, and maybe it's a little jaded, but that you get 12 jurors, in a room hearing the evidence, that there may be just one or two that sees a former president in the dock and wants such clear smoking gun level Law and Order drama that just really kind of nails him.
But they had it. They had smoking. I mean, they didn't
literally have Donald Trump saying a version of what he said in Georgia, which was, find me the, umpteen thousand votes that I need to get.
No, but they had tapes with him and Michael Cohen's, kind of talking about the payment to Stormy Daniels. I think that, a lot of people were worried, and I was worried that there was one juror that was sort of in the tank for Trump. The Trump campaign was floating this theory that one Trump juror kind of kept making meaningful eye contact with them, that they were lighting up when J.D. Vance came into the room. So I certainly worried about that. But in terms of the evidence, it was just so incredibly open and shut.
Let me ask you that, Michelle. Who do you think was the key witness, in your opinion, looking back on it, that got to conviction on all the charges?
Oh God, that's really hard. I mean, I think that Hope Hicks was really important because she obviously wasn't trying to throw Donald Trump under the bus and actually burst into tears, but also blew up the whole story again, that the Access Hollywood tape wasn't a big deal.
David, what about you?
You know, I think of a number of people. I think when early in the trial, when they set up the catch and kill process and sort of showed how all of that works, I think that was very important. It's a very simple and easy to understand way of explaining how he suppressed negative information. And one of the things you learn in a jury trial is the side that can tell the most compelling and easy to understand story has an immense advantage. And the prosecution here had a real advantage because they had a very compelling story, which was to save his campaign, he was going to pay hush money. And as part of paying hush money, he had to conceal it. You know, the hush applied in all directions. He was concealing it from the public. He was even disguising the payments internally. All of this was designed to save this campaign that was in a point of crisis and floundering. That's an elevator pitch. That's a quick statement of the case. And then they proceeded to, in detail, provide the substantiation. That's not to say that the case was necessarily a complete slam dunk. There were factual elements that the defense could have made more hay on, but I'm not necessarily convinced that the defense was tainted, in my view, too much by keeping one eye on the politics of the case.
Well, the defense had to burn a lot of their credibility. I don't know about a lot of their credibility, but the defense had to burn some of their credibility, insisting that this affair never happened.
Right.
We're actually calling it an affair is an overstatement, but insisting that the sex never happened.
David, I want to ask you, this is guilty on all 34 felony counts, not just a few, but all 34 counts. How significant?
So secular people and left-wingers and Democrats are amazed that Donald Trump attracts so much support from the religious right. But the religious right, recognizes the moral weakness of people, all right? They recognize the moral weakness of men, in particular with regard to sexual temptation. So there's this conception with a solid basis in reality that religious people tend to be more removed from reality. But in some ways, religious people are more in reality because you're much more likely to hear bogus understandings of male versus female nature on the left than the right. For example, the New York Times repeatedly runs this piece that sex experts wish that people would understand that the male and female sex drive are pretty similar. And that's absolutely nonsense. How many famous female celebrities and politicians, right, have lost everything due to a sex scandal? Almost never occurs. All right, there are 100 times as many male politicians when compared to female politicians who lose everything or are considerably damaged by a sex scandal compared to female politicians. Why is that? Because the male sex drive is so much more powerful. Now, the first year of a relationship, and I've had many relationships that lasted up to about 1 year, the male-female sex drive tends to be in the same ballpark. But after a year, all right, from various academic surveys, the female sex drive just drops off a cliff, and there is a dramatic difference between the male and female sex drive. And so there's also a dramatic difference in the male versus female desire for anonymous sex or sex with strangers or near strangers, or a willingness to risk everything for sexual interaction, right? The male sex drive is so strong that most men who have any possible plausible reason to think that they can get away with it will risk everything, all right, for a sexual interaction with an attractive young woman, while very few accomplished women will risk everything for a sexual interaction with some young, attractive man that they don't know very well. So there is a dramatic difference in the male-female sex drive. Secular people frequently will deny this, right? The liberal zeitgeist, as articulated by the New York Times, will often deny this. On the other hand, religious Christians, religious Jews, religious Muslims understand there is effectively a substantial difference in the sex drive between men and women, and they recognize the male weakness. And so that's why the various religions have developed these strategies for trying to keep out of sexual trouble. For example, former Vice President Mike Pence would not, go to lunch with a woman alone without the company of his wife. He would not be alone with women, not his wife, because he recognized the male predisposition for temptation. In Orthodox Judaism, there is a strategy and a custom to not shake hands, let alone hug the opposite sex who aren't family members. And so the various traditional ways of life have evolved all sorts of different strategies for trying to minimize the opportunities that will lead to men, straying and committing sexual behavior completely against their best interests. Like women don't tend to give up everything, don't tend to risk everything, don't tend to throw away their families, their careers, right, for meaningless sex with somebody attractive. So there is a substantial sex drive difference between men and women. And people on the traditional end of the spectrum are more likely to see this than secularists, and people who are right-wing and religious see this more likely than secularists.
Again, is that?
Well, it's very significant in two directions. I mean, first, this is about as thorough a drubbing that you're going to see a prosecution inflict on a defense at trial. A conviction on all counts is quite significant independently. The other thing, though, that is very significant is you have this conviction on all counts against a backdrop where Trump has been repeatedly held in contempt during the course of this trial. He demonstrates, at least so far, zero remorse at all. And so when you're talking about sentencing and what sentencing will look like, you'll have a verdict on all counts, a defendant who shows zero remorse, and a defendant who's been held in contempt multiple times during the criminal proceeding. Now, in normal cases, that tends to mean that sentencing gets more draconian because judges are looking for contrition. They're looking for cooperation. They are looking for some reason to mitigate the sentence.
Not this guy, David.
Not this guy. In this case, the most mitigating factor is, of course, this is his first conviction of a nonviolent felony. And that's typically, you don't typically get jail time in that circumstance, or you don't typically get hit with the harder edge sentence. In this case, the first time nonviolent felony is balanced against 34 counts, no remorse, multiple acts of contempt. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the judge resolves this in sentencing in July.
Yeah, let's just clear that up right now because you two are the best in the business with predictions. I mean, is Trump going to jail, Michelle? Is Trump, in terms of that sentencing, and it's a first conviction, but there's no contrition, is he going to go to jail?
So I'm not going to hazard a guess as to whether or not he goes to jail for this. I think the question of whether or not Donald Trump ultimately goes to jail is, one of the central issues in this election. If he loses, I think he goes to jail on something, right? This was the least serious of the felony trials that await him. And some of those have been, kind of postponed through the machinations of his various lackeys, on the Supreme Court and on other courts, but they're going to happen eventually.
All right, let's have a look at this New York Times piece that I was just referencing. 8 sex myths that experts would wish would go away. One of the 8, men want sex more than women do. Right, that's obvious. All right, how many female celebrities or famous female women, powerful female women, female politicians, right, give up everything for sex with some pretty young man? So myth number 5, men always want sex more than women do. All right, obviously that's not true anytime you use always. Desire discrepancy is number one problem I deal with in my practice, and by no means is the higher desire partner always male. Well, yeah, men in a committed relationship may lose the desire to have sex with their wife. Right? Men often feel a sense of shame around their lack of desire and a pressure to always initiate, but that doesn't mean that men don't want sex with attractive young women. So, yeah, men do masturbate or more often than women do. It's untrue that women don't want sex or that men always do. Yeah, of course, women will want sex with particular men under certain circumstances, but there is a substantial difference in the sex drives between men and women. And, anyone who denies this is living in a fantasy world. And in this regard and many other areas, right, traditional people, including traditional religious Christians and Jews, are more rooted in reality than men. Looking at the chat, notes yichud prohibition, right, on secluding oneself with the opposite sex. Mike Pence's prudent precautions was very much in line with traditional Judaism.
And I think that, this again is a shot in the arm. It's a reminder to people that this can
Right, this is New York Times op-ed columnist Michelle Goldberg, a reliable lefty.
Happen. But if Donald Trump is elected, presumably even if he gets sentenced to jail in July at sentencing, he appeals, right? And presumably he's on bail pending appeal, and this stretches past the election. And then you kind of have this question of Donald Trump in office with a jail sentence on the other side and already a disinclination to leave. I just think that sort of, he's already started talking, kind of kidding, not kidding about serving 3 terms. But for those of us who are worried that Donald Trump becomes president again, he is not going to leave the White House voluntarily while he's still alive. I think that the prospect of jail sentence on the other end kind of.
All right, Michael Tracy often has some of the sharpest nonpartisan political commentary. He notes Trump is the most powerful politician in the country when gauged by sheer political influence. He doesn't wield formal state power, but his current political influence has no obvious historical parallel. People underappreciate the historical anomaly of a 3-time presidential nominee who also happens to be a former president with all the massive political cachet that entails. We have nothing to compare this to. Right? Trump picks and chooses GOP primary winners with one social media post, largely based on who pays sufficient fealty to him. The Speaker of the House is basically his personal puppet. A marked shift from 2016, when the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, was, often doing as much as he could to undercut Donald Trump. Right, back to New York Times opinion columnist.
David, the jury came back in just 2 days, a very relatively quick return,
and this was recorded 2 hours after the verdict on Thursday.
Said, guilty on all counts. And I'm thinking about Michelle's point just about jail time sooner rather than later. I am wondering if this judge in sentencing in July looks at that quick verdict, that absolute, it seems like, certainty verdict, and does come back with some jail time. What do you think? And does the timing affect it at all, or is that just apples and oranges?
Even though Trump has not been remorseful, even though Trump was cited multiple times for contempt, I'm still of the view that it's a stretch that he'll serve time in prison because of that first-time nonviolent felony status. I'm much less confident of that than I was 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have said, no, Patrick, no way he's going to spend time in jail. Now, I'm not as sure. I would still be surprised. But what I would also say is, Michelle hit on something very important. There's an appeal coming here. And so this case is not over. There is going to be an appeal, and the appeal will be fought on the grounds where the prosecution is weakest. And the prosecution is weakest when it comes to the underlying legal theory.
Michelle, you attended the trial and you wrote about how a lot of Americans are really kind of tuning out the proceedings. I'm very interested in the impact that this verdict is going to have, particularly on swing voters, just in the weeks and months to come. As we sit here now, it's a historic result, but what kinds of impact do you think the verdict might have on certain voters, on the election?
So look, obviously, I think most voters are locked in, and I don't believe those surveys in which 17% of voters say that a conviction will change their minds. I think most of them will be able to rationalize voting for a felon. But, our elections tend to be extremely close. And so we're not talking about that many, it doesn't have to change that many people's minds for it to have a big impact. I think a lot of people, for example, in 2016, think that Comey reopening the case against Hillary Clinton was something that was decisive in that election.
All right. On a different note, there's a Financial Times article, "We need to put sand in the gears of the Russian war machine." And my reaction is putting sand into the Russian war machine might well precipitate a larger conflict with Russia that could cost, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of lives. Even the potential eventual extinction of life on Earth sounds like a bad bet to me. Colin Liddell responds, "Once you give in to blackmail once, why would they stop blackmailing you until they have everything you own?" The point is that we have no vital national security interests in Ukraine, and neither does the rest of Europe. So giving as much of Ukraine to Russia as it wants, right, does not harm the national security of France or Germany or Norway or England or the United States. So you stop giving in to blackmail once they threaten your vital strategic interests, right? Ukraine has nothing to do with the vital strategic interests of the United States and also for much of Europe.
Election, even though, you kind of think about who are the people who are going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and then that changed their mind. In as much as there's a sort of tipping point of scandal, and in as much as people think, well, this is just going to be too chaotic to have a president who might be in jail or who's running to keep himself out of jail, again, it doesn't have to change that many minds for it to be really important. And then the other thing I'd say is that part of the impact could be precisely because people haven't been paying a lot of attention. So the New York Times Siena poll of swing voters showed that most of them did not expect him to be convicted. Large numbers of Republicans, but also independents, and even pretty significant numbers of Democrats. And so the fact that he was convicted is going to be jarring for some people, and again, may cause at least a few of them to rethink some of their priors.
It's such an important point, Michelle.
So when I hear Donald Trump talk, right, he doesn't sound convincing or appealing to me. I'm wondering, when did Donald Trump last give a powerful speech? I thought his Friday reaction talk was pathetic. I wished he would have taken questions from the news media. He'd promised a press conference and didn't deliver. On the other hand, right, there are now more Americans identifying as Republican than Democrats for the first time since a brief period in 1994. And I think much of that is owed to the effectiveness of Donald Trump's appeal to the white working class, to significant segments of men in the African American, Latino, and Asian communities. And so one nickname that I've heard for Donald Trump is the parole whisperer, right? He knows how to make an effective case to people with a 90 or a 95 IQ, that to people with an IQ over 120, that case just sounds completely ridiculous.
Detail. They asked for headsets as well. They wanted to listen to something. And when you thought about everything else, the McDougal calls they were asking for, it struck me they wanted to listen to Cohen's tape of Trump. So all those things zeroed in on Trump, and in two ways. First, showed him to be a liar, as far as McDougal went, and I think that made him.
Right. This is former U.S. Attorney Harry Lippman talking to Al Franken.
All they needed to know he was lying about Stormy Daniels. But second, and more importantly, it was a repeated command by Trump, work through Cohen. So it both showed him as the moving force and showed Cohen as.
I read your last piece, and it scared me because you said there are more registered Republicans than Democrats. Is that what I got out of that?
No, it's not
like
registered.
1%.
It's not registered Republicans. This is in polling. When you do a poll,
I see.
Getting the demographics. You ask people, do you identify with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or neither?
Okay, I read that wrong.
And I mean, it's a common. It's a common. Because there are any number of states that don't register you by party. You just register.
So this is in polling.
Yeah, it's how people say they identify.
Now, this scared me.
Well, probably, as a Democrat, it should worry you, because this was something that was pointed out by Bill McInturff, who's a Republican pollster. And I've known Bill and worked with Bill for many years, and he's a very solid pollster. And he's
All right, this is Washington Post chief correspondent Dan Balls here talking with Al Franken.
Part of the team, his firm and the Hart Research Associates, a Democratic firm, combined to do the NBC News polling. And this is all data that's drawn from the NBC polls. What he noticed is that for the...
And how much of Republican support is due to trans overreach? And I think a substantial part of this new Republican support is, for the first time in my lifetime, Republicans are consistently winning the culture wars. So this has been a trend for at least 3 years now. And I can't remember any other time in my lifetime when the right was consistently winning the culture wars.
First time in a long time, as he put it, the lines crossed, that there were 41% combined recent polling indicated that they identify as Republicans, 40% for Democrats.
I see. Okay.
We took the stuff back 8 years, which is kind of the beginning of Trump. And the Democrats had a lead of, 6, 7 points.
7 points, something like that.
And now it's gone.
What's scary about this to me is it seems that I think the reason the margin was 6 or 7 points before was that a lot of Republicans became never Trumpers and stopped identifying as.
No, there's just always been a generic Democratic advantage in the polling, all right, in identifying with one party. But it used to be that Democrats were the less likely to show up and actually vote. Now, a majority of low inclination voters, or a higher number of low inclination voters for the first time since we've been measuring this, are Republican voters, people who'd vote Republican if they'd only show up to the polls. So this is completely unprecedented. For as long as we've been following this, the voters who are eligible to vote and don't show up to the polls are now more Republican than Democrat. And we haven't seen this before. Right, back to New York Times op-ed columnist discussing the Trump conviction.
Michelle, I mean, throughout the primaries last year and into this year, so many people thought that he wouldn't get convicted. And there were Republicans in our New York Times focus groups who didn't think Donald Trump would be the nominee, that there were too many obstacles to him. There is such a power that comes from the simple fact that he has now been convicted. And I'm not sure how that gets messaged by the other side, but with 5 months to go, I think that there will be voters in those suburbs of Philadelphia or in some of the northern parts of Wisconsin that can be on the swingier side and that care to some degree about ethics and government.
And let's remember, he's going to be sentenced like 3 or 4 days before the Republican convention. Yep. So this is going to stay top of mind.
Totally.
The other thing about this that I think is very interesting is the people who are the repeat voters, like the 2020 voters, the people who are most engaged, they're Biden. It's the people who are disengaged that are supporting Trump. The people who are the lower propensity.
Yeah, the lower propensity voter for the first time is supporting the Republican. Michael Tracy, another good tweet. H.L. Mencken wrote that Americans can only tolerate news events presented as simple combat with one side clearly right and the other clearly wrong. They can no more imagine neutrality than they can imagine the fourth dimension. He wrote that in 1926. Not much has changed since. And why would Democrats and the Democratic legal establishment that railroaded through this Trump conviction, why would they be exempt from consequences? There's an article here in the New York Times. Faith-based groups that assist migrants become targets of extremists. These are faith-based groups that often assist illegal migrants or refugees. If such migrants are not in Americans' interests, why would faith-based groups that assist the immigration of people who are not in America's best interest, why would they be immune from consequences, right? If Americans become revolted by the Democratic Party use of lawfare, why would Democrats be exempt from consequences? Okay, back to New York Times op-ed.
Voters, the less engaged people tend to support Trump. That's a huge challenge for the Biden campaign because you can sit there and say to them, well, you need to change your messaging or you need to change your strategy in some way. But if the voters are disengaged, they won't know anything about the messaging change. But you know what does break through? Trump convicted. Those two words, Trump convicted, that's something that breaks through even if you're only getting your news occasionally on TikTok or on Facebook. And I think that this has a real potential to break through with the very disengaged voters that are Biden's weakness right now. And yes, some of them will reflectively sort of have that distrust of institutions and say this was political, but others are going to be surprised to hear that Donald Trump was convicted of a felony. And that will shake some people. And I'm not naive. I know that some hope that the dam will break and all the Trump support will be washed away. That's 2016 thinking. That's not 2024 thinking. But what is possible?
Right. This is Patrick Healy. All right. This is a longtime New York Times political correspondent. So he's clearly got a dog in this race. Right. He's obviously left leaning, and he was the same way when he was a political correspondent.
Is more erosion, more chipping away at that Trump support. And the more the disengaged voters are exposed to those two words, Trump convicted, the more that might make a difference. But I have to.
All right. I was looking at a reaction by academic Aaron W. Hughes. He's an expert in Judaism and in Islam. He's an academic. He published a book on seminary to university and institutional history of the study of religion in Canada. And he notes in his reaction to his critics, all our narratives, all our terms, all our categories, all our frames of references emerge from the shadows, and we would do well to illumine them. And that's what I try to do on this show, right? I try to deconstruct our narratives, our terms, our categories, our frames of reference, take them out of the shadows and shine the light on them. So only by understanding these narratives, these frames of references, their genealogies, their investment in political, legal, intellectual, and social contexts, is it possible to reflect on where we have been, where we currently are, and where we are heading. And so that's why I use the term decoding in so many of my shows.
Raise the issue of the appeal again. Here's something I'm worried about. I'm worried about a situation where Trump is convicted, he loses a close election, and then the case is tossed on appeal, which is quite possible. And I think that could be a very negative development if that happens. And I'm actually quite worried about that.
I think you're talking about a short-term point and a long-term point, David, that are really important. Short-term, language that can break through is so important. In 2016, we had build a wall, Mexico will pay for it, lock her up. There were just certain phrases, as outrageous as they were, that stayed with people. In 2020, there was a certain degree of like normalcy, or let's just get back to normal. That was sort of a soft pitch, but it worked for a lot of people. It spoke to where they were. Trump convicted may not be a hopeful or aspirational message, but it is something that brands the opponent better than trying to convince people that the economy wasn't as great under Donald Trump as it was under Joe Biden. The risk of explaining politics too much doesn't redound in the same way as one kind of like strong message like Trump convicted. Now longer.
And the reason these people on the left here are worried about Trump's appeal is that they recognize that the legal theory that was the basis for the conviction is bogus.
Term, I mentioned at the top about American unity. I am very curious about how all this washes out. I think Michelle is right that those other cases are more likely to lead to jail time. But when history gets written and the MAGA base still exists, 4-8 years from now, if Donald Trump looks like he's someone who was kind of put through the legal ringer and there was what seems to people like unfairness, witch hunt, rigged system, if there's questions about appeal, if it turns out messier than one might hope, that could have its own damaging effect.
Wait, can I just push back on that a little bit? Because I just feel like we never talk about the sense of injustice experienced by people who've had to watch Donald Trump enjoy impunity over and over again. There's a lot of people who have lost faith in, and I include myself among them, who started out cynical about the Supreme Court and who now see it as a wholly corrupt institution. I feel like there's always a lot of worry about the MAGA base and their view of the legitimacy of institutions. And again, I just think that the MAGA base is going to feel victimized almost no matter what happens, right? They won an election in 2016 despite losing the popular vote really decisively, and then spent, 4 years feeling like they had somehow been mistreated. And so, that's happening no matter what. I do think that one thing that could potentially, and again, this might be wishful thinking, but I also think Donald Trump loses this election. I mean, again, maybe this is just like kind of hopium, but I don't think if he loses, he's going to be the candidate in 2028.
So, every group has a basis for feeling victimized. All right, Michelle Goldberg here on the left feels victimized that the political process hasn't, been harsher to Donald Trump. Right, Donald Trump's supporters feel victimized that he, wasn't given a fair go, that a bogus story that Trump colluded with Russia dominated the news in America for approximately 3 years between 2016 and 2019 and impeded Donald Trump's ability to govern. So whatever side you're on, you're going to find a basis for feeling victimized. And the stronger your in-group identity, whether as a left-winger, as a right-winger, as a Jew, Christian, as gay or trans, the stronger your identity, the more strongly you will feel that your group is victimized.
So basically what President Trump was charged with is in New York a misdemeanor, creating false business records. The statute of limitations had expired on that, and they wanted to make it a felony. So in New York, it's a felony to falsify business records in order to commit or conceal another crime. That other crime was never identified. It wasn't identified in the indictment. It wasn't identified throughout the trial. It wasn't identified in the jury instructions. Instead, the judge said, just, kind of figure out, maybe there's something out there. He gave, so that's what they mean, that nobody even knows what crime he was convicted of. Example of this, I was explaining why there's big presidential immunity issues for President Trump, including that the Supreme Court's decision coming in the next 30 days may vacate this entire verdict. And I had people on the anti-Trump side on social media saying that can't be the case because this crime was committed before he was inaugurated as president. They don't even realize that isn't what Trump was charged with. That Trump's crime was the false business records while he was president, according to the allegations of the jury, not anything that happened beforehand. But the fact that...
Right. When I try to explain this to people who live outside of the United States, they fail to see how this could rise to the level of a felony conviction.
People that followed the case intently, they don't even know what crime it was he was convicted of. Tells you how absurd the case is.
What is this about? Well, I just watched a brief analysis by Alan Dershowitz, who ran through the whole thing. And so he said, this is the worst case I've seen in 60 years. And he says, I think it's a very bad day for America. Worse day for America than it is for Donald Trump, because maybe Trump might still get elected after all this. But for America, now we spiral downward to lawfare on all sides, people getting revenge for this. I'm not sure that, frankly, from what I've seen, that the right wing has it in them to do this. They've been sitting around thinking that, I think very naively about the state of it.
Right. He doesn't want to talk about how those with the most expertise and the most power tend to be on the left. And so it's not so much that the right wing doesn't want to do things like this. Question is the right wing capable of doing things like this? Does it have enough expertise?
Of American law. But he also mentioned, as we read about, the judge's, what he called false instructions to the jury. So what exactly did he say to the jury that was wrong?
The key aspect, there was multiple aspects with the jury instructions in general, but the big one was he told the jury they can convict Trump of a crime without even deciding what crime it was, without deciding it beyond a reasonable doubt, without all unanimous jurors agreeing as to what the crime was. And that's a jury instruction that has really never been issued in the history of the United States. I mean, it basically, he took Maria's show me the man, I'll find you the crime principle, and that was his instruction to the jury, with Kafka's The Trial. And he decided, let's see what it would look like if we combine the two in real time. And that's the nature of the jury instruction. It's not only...
So if you've left the United States and then come back in through American customs, you'll understand that you're generally regarded, or just flying in the United States, you'll understand people operating customs generally regard you as the enemy, which is a very different experience as an Australian returning to Australia and going through Australian customs. So when you go to the DMV, again, you often feel like you're being treated as the enemy. And Americans at a far lower rate than I think any other first world nation feel like the people who control our institutions are a hostile elite, and that our institutions are, not aligned with our best interests. So this Trump conviction may very well increase this sentiment that Americans see most of their institutions in the hands of this left of center hostile elite. And right now, the technical legal competence and expertise in many areas of life seem to be in the hands of those who are left of center.
An issue under New York law. It's an issue under federal constitutional law. It gives the Supreme Court of the United States jurisdiction to hear this appeal at some point, because it's a due process issue. not only you have a due process right to know what it is you're being accused of from the beginning in this Alice in Wonderland prosecution that was denied, but you're also entitled to unanimous jurors on any element of the offense and into a beyond a reasonable doubt standard as well. And that was eviscerated by the jury instructions.
So a few years ago, I did some streams on Hitler and abductive logic, the legal strategy of a tyrant. And during times of trauma, right, the abductive reason, the abductive logic, the ability to construct a story for the best explanation of what's going on has particular power. And so chapter 3 of this book, Hitler and Abductive Logic, the Strategy of a Tyrant, here by Ben Novak, is relevant to what's going on right now. So abductive logic is particularly strong in certain situations, right? Abductive logic is detective logic. It is logic that reasons from the best explanation, right? What's the best inference? What's the single best explanation for what's going on, right? So in times of political confusion, social upheaval, economic dislocation, national trauma, all right, someone who can provide the single best explanation of what's going on is going to give us a narrative that resonates, right? We want a narrative to be effective. It has to resonate with people intellectually, empirically, and also psychologically, socially, morally, spiritually. You want it resonating on many different levels. So when social conditions change, particularly in a surprising and negative way, people become confused. They become disoriented. They start to feel lost. They are anxious. And what they most want is an explanation that will make sense and restore order in their minds and give meaningful direction to their actions. And so the dominant right-wing explanation for why we're in trouble right now is that our institutions are in the hands of a hostile elite, and this Trump conviction will further that explanation. Now, the primary explanation on the left is that Americans suffer from misinformation and from a lack of education, right? So the greatest right-wing fear is disorder and filth and contamination, and the greatest left-wing fear tends to be ignorance and bigotry. So when political leaders can explain the unexpected and the dislocating in a satisfactory manner, people will often place their faith in these leaders. When people and nations undergo great hardship and they overcome extreme difficulties with dedication and good cheer, they usually believe the explanations coming from their leaders. So the essence of abduction is that it is a form of logic whose purpose is to generate some kind of plausible hypothesis to explain a strange set of facts or events. And so when Americans feel like their institutions are overwhelmingly aligned against them, that they're not getting a fair go in the courts, in college admissions, in the workplace, right, in their experiences with government departments, right, they want some kind of explanation. So in these times, right, if you can come up with a narrative that explains what's going on, right, this isn't just some abstract method of science. It's not just a formula, all right? It's a narrative that appeals to the mind and to the emotions and to all parts of our mental processes. And it's very difficult to undo this kind of explanation, right? Once people hear this sort of abductive logic, the reasoning from inference to the best explanation, all right, it tends to stick. So when you can present people with something that ties together all these disparate parts, right, which Republicans are doing, which is why people now identify more with Republicans than Democrats, right, then you've got a powerful narrative. So Donald Trump's defense did not present a powerful narrative, but the Republican political apparatus, right, has the opportunity to go forward with an explanation that's going to resonate with a substantial part of the population, particularly in swing states.
Is it what we're reading is that the bookkeeping miscategorized a hush payment? I mean, is that the heart of the case, or what?
Yeah, essentially, Michael Cohen issued a legal invoice for legal expenses. The bookkeeper, who never took any instructions from Trump, saw that, and so when it was paid, booked it internally as a legal expense because that's the option in the drop-down menu. They converted that into a state felony, and the way they converted that into a state felony is they claimed that apparently you're supposed to list a non-disclosure agreement as hush payment to make sure nobody knows that I paid this money, which is, by the way, you can find the accounting records, find your GAAP principles, try to find the one where it says, thou shalt forever declare any non-disclosure agreement as a secret hush money payment in explicit and express terms of the bookkeeping. So they made up something on accounting that doesn't exist. And then they made up a federal crime that the FEC admitted didn't happen here. Really what they did is they took Hillary Clinton's crime, where she was doing illegal investigative work using foreign agents to.
So depending on your identity, you're going to react to the Trump conviction and to, all the things that confront America in completely different ways. And I was reading about a good explanation of identity in a 2010 essay by Aaron W. Hughes, right? He is a professor at the Institute of Jewish Thought at State University, New York, Buffalo. And he writes here about science, envy, and theories of religion. The recent theories about religion have largely shifted from the cultural to the biological. And he mentions contemporary theories of religion. This publication back in 2019, at least 15 chapters devoted to theories of religion that come from the basis of essentially evolution. And instead, Aaron W. Hughes recommends theories of identity, right? So according to this journal back in 2009, religions answer 4 overlapping questions, right? What is unique about religion? What are the origins of religion? What are the functions of religion? What's the structure of religion? But for Aaron W. Hughes, he says the specificity of religion is its evocation of transcendence for believers, right? How religion works for people who believe in it. That religion is invoked or appealed to in the invention of cultural identity, right? Religion is key for many people's identity. This main function is to provide individuals and groups with identity, and that its structure is its lack of structure, meaning that religion is porous, right? That many different forces can enter into it, and its porosity and instability permit many and contradictory appeals over time and geography. So the primary appeal of religion is not its set of ethical strictures or its theology or its cultic practices, right? The main appeal of religion, how religion works, is in terms of giving people identity, purpose, meaning, and a hero system. And there are 4 key terms that Aaron W. Hughes uses here: identity, discourse, and invention, right? A few key terms. So identity is, what permits individuals and groups to identify as part of something discrete and identifiable, a cultural group with enemies. And so appeals to various tropes or function to maintain group solidarity and create boundaries between themselves and outsiders, right? And these borders are not necessarily intrinsic or natural or biological, but they're cultural inventions. Well, I would say that they're also partly biological, right? Aaron W. Hughes wants to attribute all this to culture and wants to deny, I think, the influence of biology, right? These borders are never static, but ones that change through time. Yes, and they're often in counterpoint with other markers of identity, such as class, gender, and race. True. Now, this theory of religion has many advantages, but it's also true for theories of political identification, all right? It puts its primacy on the why of religion as opposed to how, makes no distinction between dimensions of signifiers such as religious or sacred and other forms of society. So it looks at religion as a subset of culture, and culture is the interface between genetics and environment. And then it enables us to account for the cultural, historical, and social record. So why do people at different historical periods identify the way they do? Why do they identify as religious? Maybe the primary reason is not matters of theology. And this theory also accounts for change. So rather than assuming that terms such as Islam or Judaism or Christianity are stable, I contend that they are constantly changing, reimagined, invented, and reinvented, as opposed to having one powerful essence. So Aaron W. Hughes is calling for replacing one sort of reductionism, biological and cognitive, with another type, identity, right? And that helps us to understand the ubiquity of religion, right? So he sees religion as it is folded into other historical, social, cultural, economic, and political forces. He wants to look at how religion contributes to the invention of cultural identity. So, for example, many people who don't really think much about Jesus or the theological tenets of Christianity will identify as Christian to show, one, that they don't identify as gay, they don't identify as globalist, right? They don't identify with the left, they don't identify as woke. And so in their particular time and space, identifying as Christian is the most effective way to identify, even if they don't really believe in any of the theological tenets of Christianity.
Spread the lie about Russiagate, and she disguised it all to hide it from the FCC as legal fees. So that was like the actual crime actually committed in New York. And they just pretended Trump did it by converting an NDA disclosure issue into accounting fraud, bookkeeping fraud, and election fraud.
Tucker Carlson made a statement on Twitter that I couldn't agree with more, and he ended it by saying that anybody who defends this verdict is a danger to you and your family. You think that's an exaggeration?
Definitely not an exaggeration. I told you, if you see any lawyer, legal advertiser, legal commentator, legal influencer in any way rationalizing, excusing, or justifying this case, they are a threat to the republic and a threat to you, and you should take it accordingly. Because if they're willing to lie and libel the law, libel the Constitution in order to advance their political and personal and partisan agenda against the President of the United States.
Right, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Most people don't think deeply about religion. Only about 5% of people can come up with a coherent political ideology, and so don't allow the verdict or any political development to create unnecessary space between you and the people who are important to you.
States and future President of the United States, that by golly, they'll do it to the rest of us. When people show you that they want to unleash the French Revolution, take them at their word and respond accordingly.
How do they get around the statute of limitations problem?
The statute of limitations only applied if it was a misdemeanor. And the way they got around it was by hijacking it and claiming, no, really, all of these bookkeeping entries were meant to cover up another crime. Problem was there was no other crime. So the judge said, just imagine there is one.
Okay. So I mean, it's like you can't believe. It's like when you go back and look, frankly, at the stuff about how they concluded that the COVID shot was 100% effective. It was that they had two groups. They had a control group and.
Right. Those people who argued that the COVID shot was 100% effective, that it would prevent you from getting COVID, that it would prevent you from dying from COVID, and that it would prevent you from getting hospitalized, were not speaking as virologists, right? These were generally politicians and public health officials who were trying to dumb down the case for getting vaccinated. And so they exaggerated the benefits. And I'm a big believer in getting vaccinated, but it isn't a magic key, right? It doesn't automatically mean you won't get sick, you won't get hospitalized, and you won't die. It just reduces your odds. But, that kind of statistical sophistication is not going to create a compelling case to people with average and below average IQs. And so a lot of people lied in a noble cause by exaggerating the efficacy of the COVID vaccine. And then this causes a decrease in credibility for many scientists and public health officials.
One of them got 2 infections and one got 1. And since 2 is 100% more than 1, is 100% of, I mean, it's just absolutely nuts. And you think, until you saw that document, you thought, they're probably exaggerating. And likewise with this case, I would hear commentators talking about it, and I'd say, maybe they're just being one-sided. And then you look at it yourself and you say, okay, I will never distrust them again. Now, the thing is, I think there's a bigger question that arises from all this. A lot of people have said there's no way Trump was going to get a fair trial in New York or in this area. There's no way he's going to get a fair trial. There's no way there's going to be a jury that will listen to this case impartially. So is there a bigger issue here?
Right. You don't have a constitutional right to have your trial. The legal system doesn't work nearly as effectively. For example, taking an oath is a very serious matter among Anglo-Saxons and Japanese, right? But for many other peoples, it's just ticking a box, all right? It doesn't actually mean anything. So one of my favorite blogs is Andrew Gelman. He's a statistics professor at Columbia University. And he talks about when the story becomes the story. And so if there's some kind of dominant reaction to the Trump conviction, right, eventually that story will become the story, right? So in the 1990s, all right, Michael Jordan's success became the story. And so people started rooting for Michael Jordan to break more records because it was also exciting. The same way people would talk in the 1990s about how rich Bill Gates was or the incredible Tiger Woods phenomenon. So when something gets big enough, all right, its success becomes part of the story. And if there is a dominant reaction to the Trump conviction, right, the story may very well become the story and will start feeding upon itself. Josh Hammer is a lawyer. He also is a pundit on the right, and he's got a column here for Newsweek. Post-Trump verdict, will the American right finally wake up? Says the Democrats' long march to get Donald Trump by any means necessary has finally worked. American patriots of all political stripes must come to terms with the current fallen state of the nation. The prosecution and incarceration of political opponents on trumped-up charges is third world, tin-pot dictatorship, banana republic stuff. I think that's an exaggeration. All right, the legal process has always had a substantial subjective and political component. This is just a larger political component than we used to. It doesn't reduce us to a third world tin-pot dictatorship. Right. The idea that jailing one's top political rival in an election year could ever happen in the land of the free and the home of the brave might have struck us as too ludicrous to even contemplate. But there's no reason that Donald Trump would have some automatic get out of jail card just because he's running for president. Like, Donald Trump brought his troubles on himself. Right. This kind of lawfare strategy would not have been effective against a more circumspect and diligent and righteous Republican candidate. Right. This kind of lawfare strategy is not being used by Democrats generically against Republicans. It's being used to target Donald Trump because he's vulnerable in these areas because his behavior has been far from circumspect. Right. It's incumbent upon the right to finally wake up and realize what's happening. Many conservatives and Republicans like to wax nostalgic about blindfolded Lady Justice and the neutral enforcement on the law. Will those on the right finally wake up and realize the unsustainable faux moral high ground that they are on? Right, we need to respond to the left as it has acted towards us by wielding political and prosecutorial power to reward our friends and to punish our enemies, to reward our side's forces of civilizational sanity and punish their side's forces of civilizational arson within the broad confines of the law. So yeah, does the right have the cohesion to do this? And does it have the expertise to do this? Right, back to Robert Barnes.
So in my view, we need to reinvigorate, because the courts are failing to enforce these constitutional provisions, then we need to reinvigorate them with legislative reform as well, because he was denied an impartial prosecutor, he was denied an impartial judge, and he was denied an impartial jury.
There's no right to an impartial prosecutor.
Every aspect that the Constitution is supposed to assure to determine truth, justice, and accuracy was denied Trump in this case.
Hey, everybody, one of the great things that COVID lockdowns and restrictions took from us was the...
Yeah, this guy really lads on the commercials.
His conviction on all these counts show that there was a strong case. And Dershowitz says, no, this doesn't show that at all necessarily. And I just saw the New York Times saying, well, this verdict now recasts the election fundamentally into a choice between somebody who is not a convicted felon and someone who is. And that's the way they're spinning it.
And it's been the goal all along, is to use these trials to effectively smear Trump in the court of public opinion, believing it will lead to his defeat. But the whole predicate of it is that they thought they could buy the confidence of the American people in the outcome of the case by putting on a show. That if you see a judge, you'll believe it's the law. If you see a jury, you'll believe it's the truth. If you see a prosecutor, you'll believe it's the fact. And what people on the libertarian side have long recognized, and now other people on the right are starting to recognize, just because a judge says it doesn't make it law. Just because a jury says it doesn't make it truth. Just because a cop or prosecutor says it doesn't make it fact. I'm dealing with this in another case,
he's talking about
law YouTuber, Nick Rekieta, who's subject to what appears to me a rogue government action. And the conservatives are so caught up with what they've found in the illegal, unconstitutional search, and they're suddenly saying, well, if a prosecutor said it, it must be true. If a judge signed it, it must be law. And it's like the Trump case should remind all of them that's never been the case. And we're seeing it. The fact that if a jury of 12 Klansmen convicted Martin Luther King in 1963, when we go, well, a jury found the facts, so he must be guilty. That's how.
Right. The left is saying, well, if a jury finds Trump guilty, then he must be guilty. But obviously, they wouldn't carry on that logic if it broke in a different direction. Right, Steve Saylor's got a devastating blog post here. Victims subdue Islamist knife terrorist until cops liberate him. You'll never guess what happens next. So in Mannheim, Germany, a German nationalist group was peacefully protesting when they were attacked by an Islamic terrorist with a knife. Two of the Germans wrestled the attacker to the ground and had him subdued until the police ran up and they liberated the good guy, right? The pro-Muslim attacker from the bad guys, the pro-German victims, right? Haven't you been following the news about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Right, freed, the pro-migrant good guy immediately stabbed a police officer as seen above. So this was a confusing situation. The ideological direction of this case may not be as clear as what Steve Saylor is talking about, but the overall point, even if it doesn't fit for this exact situation, happens often enough that this knee-jerk right-wing response that the police and the prosecutors should get the benefit of the doubt. I think maybe this Trump trial will cause a rethinking of that default assumption on the right.
How preposterous these claims are.
Well, one of the big questions that involves making a prediction, but that everybody is talking about and weighing in on, is whether or not there's going to be any jail time. What do you think?
I think that even if this lunatic, corrupt judge whose family is enriching themselves off of this case, something else we've never seen before at this scale in America, if he were the normal sentence is probation under these circumstances. So for this kind of first-time offense, this category, this defendant, this situation, et cetera. But and this is the same New York that's busy releasing murderers and rapists and child abusers and everything else on a routine and regular basis. If they decide to use this case to try to set a precedent of an extraordinary incarceration at Rikers Island of Donald Trump, I believe that even the appellate courts of New York and if necessary the Supreme Court of the United States would step in and stay the case pending appeal, or what's sometimes called within the state system bail pending appeal. So I don't think Trump will ever serve any time at Rikers or anywhere else on this case. I think ultimately it will be vacated. There's only any risk because you've got a trial court judge that's made clear his bias and prejudice against President Trump.
Well, then of course the question is he can appeal. Dershowitz is not convinced that he'll be successful on appeal despite the complete lack of merit in the case.
Yeah, the issue Dershowitz is concerned is that the same judicial bias that infects the Manhattan courts will infect the appellate division of those courts, and then the New York Court of Appeals, which is their equivalent of a Supreme Court in Albany. However, what I have confidence in is that if those courts fail, the unique issue here is that President Trump has a bunch of robust federal constitutional issues, which would give jurisdiction over the case to the Supreme Court of the United States. He has First Amendment selective prosecution issues. He has Fifth Amendment due process issues of all kinds, not defining the statute, not being told. Basically, what would happen if you went through a Kafka trial? Well, the due process clause of the U.S. Constitution is what prohibits that. You can't have a conflicted prosecutor involved. You can't have a conflicted judge involved. You can't have a conflicted jury involved. You can't deny someone their right to confront their accusers with meaningful cross-examination. You can't exclude critical exculpatory evidence and being the right to present a defense and present witnesses. You can't instruct the jury on a matter of law in such a way that you deny them the right to a unanimous jury on an identified crime found beyond a reasonable doubt. All of those all those violations are due process violations under the U.S. Constitution, and thereby give the Supreme Court of the United States jurisdiction to hear the appeal. And then he has additional issues in terms of what happened in the discovery part of the process, what happened during jury selection, what happened with venue and vicinage, that the jury wasn't an impartial jury, it could be from the get-go. And of course, the big one, the impeachment clause presidential immunity aspect, which the Supreme Court is currently adjudicating, and given how they're adjudicating it, may vacate this verdict before sentence even comes around.
And if this were to go to the Supreme Court, you're saying that you think it's likely that they would hear it before the election?
There's two ways they can hear it before the election. One is by a bail pending appeal or request of stay of sentence pending appeal. So let's say there's some incarceration sentence and the judge orders him to start serving it immediately. He can request bail pending appeal from that judge and a stay of the sentence. If he denies it, he can request it from the appellate division. If they deny it, he can request it from the New York Court of Appeals. And uniquely here, because of the federal constitutional issues, if they all deny it, he can request a stay of sentence pending appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. That's one way they could hear it on an expedited basis. The other is the decision they're currently handing down. So if they hand down a decision that says you cannot prosecute a former president of the United States without first impeaching and convicting him, the judge has to vacate the verdict and doesn't get to sentence him at all. Or they could do some sort of hybrid ruling that says you have to make an individualized analysis about what's presidential and personal, and strike what's presidential from the indictment, not allow evidence on that at trial, instruct accordingly to the jury, none of which occurred here. The judge refused to grant any credence whatsoever to any aspect of the immunity and impeachment clause and Article 2 issues. That would require the judge also vacate the verdict and go.
So this is a very different situation. Bro, was it too much COVID talk that got you shut down? I didn't know why. It might have just been a technical issue that shut down the live stream, or maybe I said the wrong thing. I'm very pro-vaccine, but we have to face up that many politicians and public health officials exaggerated for rhetorical effect the efficacy of the vaccine. I got a strike on TikTok for making that point, right? I'm very much pro-COVID vaccine. I just made the simple point that many public health officials and politicians exaggerated the effectiveness. It's still better than nothing. It still, I think, reduces your odds of hospitalization and death and may reduce the odds of transmission, but it doesn't live up to some of the hype, not by the leading scientists and virologists, but by public health officials and politicians who felt like they were lying for the purpose of doing something righteous. Okay, so the Trump conviction still is not creating a situation in anything like Watergate, because what's going on with this Trump trial and its aftermath is still part of the regular profane world. It hasn't been elevated through live streams and through a way of talking about it that takes it out of history. It takes it out of the realm of the profane into the realm of the purely good and evil. And so politics usually occurs on a mundane level. You've got goals, you've got power, you've got interests, and the Trump trials are taking place against this background. But when you start having the Trump trials perhaps take place against a background of good versus evil, then you start moving into a realm of righteousness and hyper moralized discussions that is removed from the normal realm of politics. So routine, profane level of politics means that you've got clashing interests, right? Non-routine politics begins when the tension between various sides is felt on a grounds of a sacred commitment. All right, this is drawing from an essay by Yale sociologist Jeffrey Alexander. He wrote about Watergate as democratic ritual. And so initially, Watergate was seen as just a normal part of politics, but then it became a sacred crisis, right? And the elites of America overwhelmingly lined up against Richard Nixon, and so you had this morality play that developed in front of us on live TV. The Trump trial was not televised, and it's still very much in the realm of the political. But if you get it raised to the level of we have to fight this pollution, and this is an existential struggle for righteousness, right? And you've got symbolic interpretation of what's going on, that we need some kind of ritual and purification process to get rid of the evil that's in our midst. Then we've moved into the sacred territory against which Watergate occurred. So Watergate changed in meaning, right? Initially it referred simply to a single event, a break-in, but then it became transformed into a symbol of moral pollution. It embodied evil and impurity. And the partisans in the Watergate struggle, as it played out on national TV in 1974, they weren't seen as partisan, right? They weren't seen as just another political player advancing their interests. Instead, they were seen as people putting out a stream of pollution. So you had this growing sense of righteous violation. You had increasing consensus against the Nixon administration. And you had a realignment of the good and bad sides of the Watergate symbolization. And so the televised hearings constitute a liminal experience, right? One that is cut off from the profane and mundane issues of normal politics. So you had this ritualized community that was created for Americans to share. You had these live hearings where we understood, that something sacred was at stake. And we were presented with a world without history, right? Its characters did not have rememberable pasts, right? It took place outside of time, right? you had it just coming across as a TV drama. And the TV editing, commentary, repetition, juxtaposition, simplification, and other techniques of the major networks allowed the Watergate story to appear mythical. And these techniques were largely invisible. You had the hushed voices of the announcers, you had the pomp and ceremony of the event, and so you had the construction through the medium of television, a sacred time and a sacred space. Right? The Trump trials have not reached this level. Right? Through TV and the Watergate hearings, tens of millions of Americans got to participate symbolically, vicariously, and emotionally in the deliberations of the committee. So viewing became seen as morally obligatory for wide segments of the population. Old routines were broken, new ones were formed, and you saw a highly simplified drama with heroes and villains, and you had these powerful symbols created. So the administration witnesses appealed to loyalty as the ultimate standard that should govern their relationship. And so they'd bring their wife and their children with them if they had them. And so you'd see the family lined up behind them, prim and proper, trying to provide symbolic links to tradition, to authority, and to personal loyalty that epitomizes the right. On the other hand, the senators were playing a different game, right? They denied any particular sentiments, motivations, or interests, right? They were presented as lacking these kind of normal human and political interests, right? They stepped out of the normal political realities of everyday life, right, where you have clashing interests. And so they denied any moral context to the behavior of the witnesses. So the only positive explanation that the senators allowed was that the conspirators were simple, they were devoid of common sense, and they were evil. And then you had the presentation of these ringing affirmations of universalistic myths of American civic culture. So the senators maintained that every American, high or low, rich or poor, acts virtuously in terms of the pure universalism of civil society, that none of the prosecution interests are selfish or inhumane. They're not concerned with money or power at the expense of fair play, that you should never be loyal to your team, to violate common good, or to make criticism towards authority unnecessary, that truth and justice are the basis of American political society. So you see the left pushing for this kind of narrative with regard to the Trump trial, that every American citizen should be rational, right? That they should have this buffered identity where they're able to use the power of pure reason. Right? People on the right are more skeptical of the power of pure reason, and they understand that our genetic tendencies and our early imprinting and our tribal incentives are more powerful usually than our reason. But for the Democrats right now, you've got Trump convicted by a jury of his peers. They want to present the law as the perfect embodiment of justice. And you have, two different narrative myths, right? So John Dean was the most compelling of the anti-Nixon witnesses, and he embodied the American detective myth, right? It's derived from the Puritan tradition. He was portrayed as someone who's just ruthlessly pursuing truth and justice without emotion or vanity, and this is how the left sees the prosecutors of Donald Trump. And then when witnesses would come forward against Donald Trump, all right, the powers that be, our leading institutions and the center left and the left, grant forgiveness to former Trump partisans in accord with their conversions to the cause of righteousness and their creation of stories about how evil and threatening Donald Trump is. So in the Watergate hearings, right, you had senators asking questions centered on three themes, right? The absolute priority of civic obligation over personal obligations, right? This is a nation of laws, not of men, right? Obviously, that is an ideal that's really reached in real life. They emphasized the obligations to civic duty and to political office are some kind of higher transcendent authority, that the laws of men must give way to the laws of God. What's more important, not violating laws or not violating ethics. And this transcendent anchoring of ethics allows Americans to be concretely universal in it together. So you had Senator Weicker, a liberal Republican, saying Republicans do not cover up. Republicans do not go ahead and threaten. Republicans don't view their fellow Americans as enemies to be harassed, but as human beings to be loved and to won. And so you'll have many of the anti-Trump Republicans essentially trying to make the case today that Republicans don't have sex with porn stars, they don't pay off porn stars, they don't engage in this kind of tawdry behavior. Now, normally these statements are greeted with derision, with hoots, and with cynicism. But during Watergate, right, these statements were not laughed at. They were not hooted down because this was not everyday life. This took place within a ritual, within a liminal event, something that's separated from normal life. And you had the creation of a sacred time and a sacred space. In the hearing chambers, the Watergate Committee evoked these luminescent, transcendent values. They were not describing empirical facts. And we have not yet reached that level with the Trump prosecution. So that's why the Trump trials are not Watergate.
Go back and restart the process all over again. So that's how SCOTUS might have more to say about this long before Election Day.
Hey, everybody, Father's Day is around the corner, and you do not want to get your dad another knickknack.
Okay.
The question about how this affects Trump's electoral prospects is an interesting one, because, of course, there are going to be some what we might call normies who are, quote unquote, independents, who might have been willing to listen to him, but now I can't vote for a convicted felon. But on the other hand, I have seen, now, all right, look, I've curated my Twitter feed pretty well. So